This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
Good afternoon and welcome to Left in Black. We're joined by Professor Wizdom Powell, Professor of Health Behavior and Health Education at the Gilling School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, just right down the road. Professor Powell is the author of Taking It Like a Man, Masculine Role Norms as Moderators of the Racial Discrimination Depressive Symptoms Association among African American Men, which was just published in the American Journal of Public Health. How are you doing today, Wizdom?
I'm doing well, thank you. And thank you again for extending an invitation to be here. I'm excited to talk about the study.
Well, we're so happy to have you on the show. Talk a little bit about this research. There's been very little research, in fact, on black men and depression. And so talk a little bit about, why there's been kind of like that gap in research that addresses these kinds of issues for black men, and what the research has, basically shown thus far.
Well, thank you. Great question, great opening. I think that one of the things that's important to point out is that this work around African American men sort of extends a general body of literature that has shown positive association between exposure to racial discrimination and poor mental health outcomes. This finding has been shown in various ethnic minority populations. And one of the key missing pieces to this linkage is the mechanisms, a better understanding of the mechanisms that link discrimination to depression. And African American men in particular have been largely understudied across a number of outcomes, but particularly with respect to mental health issues. And that primarily may have to do with a lot of the barriers to research participation that we see in this population, but also I think because people simply don't take the time to sort of meet African American men where they are to ask them these kinds of questions. So I think that the study is really important for that reason. And this study essentially wanted to figure out, why is it that some men who are exposed to racial discrimination become depressed while others do not?
You looked at 674 African American men and primarily talked to them in barber shops. I know there was research that came out about a decade ago that talked about, only places where, for instance, you can get men to be tested for certain medical situations was in the barber shop. Talk a little bit about the importance of a barber shop as a social space to be able to literally take the research to black men in a way that can begin to address some of the things that black men are dealing with.
Yeah, well, one of the things we know, Mark, about barbershops is that it's a place where black men congregate. And it's also a place where you can reach a broad cross-section of African American men from various sociodemographic backgrounds. So, for example, I was in Oakland, California, collecting this data, and in one chair on the right was the mayor, and another chair to the left was a brother who had just been released from prison. So I think that it is a great space to reach African American men and to sort of get a sense of how they are, how their lived experiences play out.
And this research is particularly important because it really does add to the kind of health disparities that we see amongst black men in comparison to white male peers, obviously, but other racial groups in this country.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the central problems with the disparities agenda, in my opinion, has been that it is focused primarily on black-white comparisons. And one issue with that is we know that there's much more heterogeneity within the African American community and within most ethnic minority communities. And so the focus just on those comparisons sort of reduces our understanding of the complexities in this population as a whole. And so my work primarily has chosen purposefully to focus on within group variation.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Wizdom Powell Hammond, who's a professor of health behavior and health education at the Gilling School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the author of a new article, Taking It Like a Man, Masculine Role Norms as Moderators of the Racial Discrimination Depressive Syndromes Association among African American Men, which was just published in the American Journal of Public Health. One of the things that your study talks about, and so, this connection between racial discrimination in black men and depression already kind of established. But part of what you do in terms of taking this conversation to another level is this kind of active self-policing of emotions, what you call restrictive emotionality, that in some ways, as the study is trying to find out, may in fact either further impact this kind of state of depression among African American men. Talk about that dynamic.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that the literature has shown is that men in general tend to underreport mental health problems. And part of the reason they do that, we are coming to understand, is because of male role socialization. So there are lots of instruction that men receive about how they should be in the world. Messages like "take it like a man," right. "Boys don't cry." All of these messages send. All of these socialization messages prompt men to hold back certain emotional experiences and to not disclose personal vulnerabilities. And what I wanted to understand was what would happen if we looked at a population of African American men who report discrimination and look to see whether or not that relationship was more pronounced among men who believe that they should hold back their emotions. And in fact, that's what we found. We, in examining this issue, what we noticed is that the relationship between discrimination and depression was like what we've seen in all other studies. Depression is a consequence of being repeatedly exposed to these daily microaggressions. Right, yeah. But this particular relationship was even more pronounced among men who believed that they should hold back their emotions in response to psychosocial stress. And that, I think, gives us some clear indications of how we can intervene with this population.
And now talk a little bit about this kind of holding back of emotions. The study, for instance, suggested there's a real generational context here. What is kind of the historical and social pressures that would force African American men to think it was actually in their best interest to hold back their emotions? I recall there was an exchange that you had with a young man on Twitter yesterday about anger, and he seemed to be stuck in a box in the way that, well, what else am I supposed to do, right? I really can't just get anger. And your response was, healthy anger is a very valid emotion that we need to use, strategically.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much there in this whole conversation about emotion and race and the consequences of disclosing your anger. We know that the world doesn't respond too kindly when African American men emote. And so I think that over time, as a survival mechanism, as a response to societal pressure, African American men don't necessarily disclose how they're feeling. One, because of the tendency for society to respond to that negatively, but also because in some ways it may present a psychological or psychosocial threat to the self. And I think in that regard, what we see is men holding back emotion because they don't want to appear to be weak, because being weak and being vulnerable puts you at greater risk for more oppression. And so I think the conversation I was having with a young man over Twitter yesterday was just trying to call our attention to the fact that anger is a legitimate emotion, and that when you don't get angry when you should, as a clinician, I'm a little worried. So I think that we have to I think anger has gotten a bad rap. I think there's places where an anger response is appropriate and other places when it's not so helpful. And from this study, what we're really trying to reinforce, or what my central message would be, it's not necessarily that holding back emotion is always a bad thing. You actually show the sign, I think, of a healthy socio-emotional competence is being able to flexibly express or restrict emotions. So we've learned this over time. Adaptation to our environment, historical experiences have taught us when and where it may be appropriate to express emotion. And I think when we feel the urge to express, it's probably because it's in response to something that needs to be released. And I think that when we work against that natural proclivity, we see a lot of the kinds of negative symptomatology that I report in the study.
I mean, part of it also highlights the fact, this kind of quandary that the African American population is in. And particularly, with the Trayvon Martin story kind of out there in the world significantly at this particular point in time. And as the study suggests, and as you cite others, this kind of correlation between restrictive emotionality and psychological health. And so here we have to raise a generation of boys to young men about being able to have to discern, what's of more value, their psychological health,
right,
or their physical health, right? Particularly in relation to deploying anger in certain kind of situations where it directly could lead to kind of violence against them.
Violent consequences. I mean, this is such a conundrum that we find ourselves in as a community. I have to say that this whole sort of push towards socializing boys to behave better in public or to wear their clothes a certain way just goes against my activist sensibilities. I feel really strongly that we need to be thinking more upstream and really pushing the structures, policies, laws to adjust themselves so that we're not creating a space for these practices to exist. I think, rather than telling our boys to not sag, not wear a hoodie. Right. I understand why parents do that. Let me just say that. But I think that while we're doing that, we also need to push the policy agenda so that we can eliminate laws like the ones that are on the books in Florida that create these kind of oppressive contexts for our boys. I want to get back to a question that you just asked me that I didn't fully explain, and that was about the generational differences. Yeah. And I think it has, some relevance here to the conversation that we're having. And one of the things we found, or I found in the study, was that this effect, this sort of that sort of enhancing effect that it has on Black men when they experience discrimination is more pronounced among older men. And my thought about that is that this is the product of long, suffering, this idea that over time, there's this cumulative burden of holding back one's emotion in response to repeated racial slights. And I think that in the case of, our young boys and men, to prevent cases like the ones that we've seen of late, I think we need to really focus more on how do we prepare our boys to sort of manage the negative emotions that come along with these events, but to teach them that to be a man really, also means to speak up and to speak out, but to do that in appropriate, healthful ways. Right.
And it's funny because when you mention that, the policy in some ways has to catch up to the behavior of young boys, it's something that we see all the time in public schooling, regardless of race. When we see young boys in general, we have school structures that are trying to fit boys into these boxes instead of allowing, a more vibrant space for those boys to be able to succeed where they are at this time, right? There's a long period of time in which we can socialize them, in ways that into adulthood and maturation.
Absolutely. It's interesting because what we end up doing is giving our boys very conflicting messages. Yeah, right, we tell them to be strong, to soldier up, to man up, and then we put them in these essentially feminizing contexts, schools that tell them to sit and be quiet, and then we've removed any sort of physical activity to give them an outlet.
Not to use their hands.
Not to use your hands. It's really contradictory. So I can imagine that our boys are confused about how they should be in the world. And that particular type of discrepancy can also create internal conflicts and subsequent negative behavior and health outcomes.
We're here with Professor Wizdom Powell Hammond, Professor of Health Behavior and Health Education at the Gilling School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's the author of a new study, Taking It Like a Man, Masculine Role Norms as Moderators of the Racial Discrimination Depressive Symptoms Association Among African American Men, which was just published in the American Journal of Public Health. What goes forward now after this particular stage in your research, Professor Powell?
Yeah, I mean, this study for me is just the beginning of a conversation. And as I pointed out in other publications about this study, you can't assume associations, causal associations from the study, because it is a cross-sectional study, meaning we looked at one slice in time and not over time, longitudinally. So we need more data to sort of verify these findings. And we also need to look specifically at how men respond in the moment to discriminatory experiences, not sort of just asking them about their adherence to a general set of norms, which is what my study did. So I think for me, the next step is to do some more ecological studies where we're actually looking at these responses in real time, and then there's subsequent effects on negative health outcomes. One particular outcome that I'm interested in is substance abuse and risk-taking behaviors, which we see sort of crossover effect at the emerging adulthood stage for African American youth in general. And so I think that the next step is to sort of verify, to look at this in real time, and to then look at other kinds of outcomes. And I think if I had to sort of figure out something that I want people to take away from this, it would be that we really need to create a context of disclosure for our boys and men. And we have to listen to them as well as watch their behavior in response to stress. I think, our boys and men don't necessarily always want to talk about how they feel, but they show us, they demonstrate it in their behavior. And I think we have to create a context where they feel comfortable seeking help for mental health problems, and where they feel like when they speak up, something's going to be done about it. Because I think that's also a conundrum they find themselves in. Why speak up when nothing's going to happen? Right. And so we have to create a community and a context of support around them, both African American women in the world, but also our broader society.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Wizdom Powell Hammond, Professor of Health Behavior and Health Education at the Gilling School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the author of the new study, Taking It Like a Man, Masculine Role Norms as Moderators of the Racial Discrimination Depressive Symptoms Association Among African American Men, which is published in the American Journal of Public Health. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Wizdom.
Thank you for having me, Mark. I really appreciate the show and what you're doing for other academicians. We really, really appreciate you, and I hope that we have an opportunity to do this again sometime soon.
Oh, absolutely. Take care. Welcome to Left to Black, and we're joined this afternoon by Dr. Micah Gilmer, who's a specialist in applied research and social enterprise and a senior partner in Frontline Solutions, a social change organization, and Mr. Joe Branch, a former associate brand manager for Nike and former senior manager of global marketing partnerships for the NBA, a founding partner in You Want Game Ventures. How are you two doing this afternoon?
Doing good.
Great.
You just launched an incredible event. Joe, you have this organization, You Want Game, and you just began this project, Game Breakers, which you're traveling around the country. Talk a little bit about what Game Breakers is and what you're hoping to achieve.
Well, Game Breakers is a collaboration between You Want Game Ventures and Frontline Solutions, Dr. Gilmer and another friend of ours, Marcus Littles. And we really want to take a look at achieving or helping Black males achieve more, through sport. So we're taking a look at student athlete development and coaching development. So New Orleans was the first market for us. It was a great opportunity during the Final Four. We went down, we worked with about 6 to 8 schools, had some excellent facilitators there, and an excellent panel. So it was a very successful event for us.
Mike, I know your research, coming out of the Duke Culture Anthropology Department a few years ago, dealt specifically with issues of Black masculinity in sports, football to be, specific. Talk a little bit about why it was important for you and Marcus and Frontline to partner with Joe on this project.
Yeah, I mean, it was the sort of what's next, right? So my dissertation research, you're right, and the sort of book I'm working on now really looks at the challenges that coaches face. So a lot of them are career educators. A lot of them care very much about kids and what they're doing, and we don't get a lot of support in terms of developing. And so this project was really a natural continuation of that work. It's sort of how do we fix it, or what's next, or what's the intervention? And then Joe really brought to the table a level of expertise around athletics, understanding the sports business, and an incredible depth in terms of the relationships that he was able to leverage. So Joe, we were able to bring in ESPN's Mike Hill to host the event, able to connect with athletic directors, coaches, folks in the sort of sports industry from across the country. And so that was just a huge value add for us.
I mean, what do either of you think to folks who will say, and I know you've heard these critiques before, that particularly amongst Black males, young Black males, that in fact there's too much attention played to athletics and sports, too much of the overdevelopment of physicality as opposed to the development of their intellect. Talk about why it's important to look at sports as an arena where you're not just dealing with the athletic aspect, but other parts of Black male identity in the context of organized sports.
Yeah, I mean, 79% of African American males at the high school level participate in organized sports.
That's
so it is
number,
just something that we cannot ignore. Yeah, so, unless you want to just work with the 21% of males who are not involved in athletics, you need to in some way reckon with athletics. I think I share a lot of the critiques of sport and of the overemphasizing athletics, and that's a lot of what we work with young people around. but you have to engage with that population. And also coaches are sort of this semi-volunteer labor pool. Some of them get paid a little bit, but I worked out my salary last year. I got $800. It worked out to about 12 cents an hour for the hours I put in. So you have this pool of folks that are a real low-cost strategy to impact youth. I mean, we already know sort of anecdotally and also from some of the research that I've been doing that coaches are mentors. They're sort of father figures. They're in many cases the first person that young people call when they encounter a tough life situation. So why not get some tools and resources in their hands to engage with these folks?
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal. We're here with Joe Branch, who's a former associate brand manager for Nike and a former senior manager of global marketing partnerships in the NBA. He's also the founding partner of You Want Game Ventures, and also Dr. Micah Gilmer, 2010 is that Duke graduate, cultural anthropology PhD, who's an applied research and social enterprise expert and a senior partner in Frontline Solutions, along with Marcus Little, a social change organization. Joe, talk a little bit about the kind of young men who have come out to these events so far, or the kind of young men that you're targeting and trying to reach in this activity.
Well, the kind of young men that we're trying to reach, we say at risk, and not just, at risk of going down the wrong direction, right? We want that student that really has that goal, that wants to, be a collegiate athlete. We feel like sport or student athletes on the high school level really have a goal in mind, So we want to help them, get there. So, for instance, in New Orleans, we looked at nutrition, we looked at branding and leadership, we looked at sports psychology, and we looked at, game fuel. And then we gave a panel discussion that really focused on, the pipeline development of the African-American male from, 5 years old to, professional athlete in different perspectives. So the high school coaches and the student athletes could sort of, understand those touch points with those different genres there.
Yeah, in the aftermath of the killing of Trayvon Martin, does a project like this even take on an added significance? Is there more of an emphasis of trying to do this kind of work and make these connections at this particular moment?
Well, I think it starts a conversation in certain markets. I mean, we want to provide that inspiration and just get coaches and athletic directors to really understand that, there's three components to developing a student athlete. One is the physical aspect, but then there's the social aspect and the career development aspect of a student athlete as well. And what we want to do is, impact these guys for the overall development of student athletes.
But I think along that point, Mark, one of the things we found working with athletes, we actually have some great footage of an athlete talking about a run-in they had with police in New Orleans. And he said the first person he called was his coach, right? So we know that, particularly for young men, many of which are growing up in an environment where they don't have a father living with them in the home. They have fathers. Many of them connect to their fathers, but they're not living with them in the home. Right. That coach is often that stand-in for those conversations when they're dealing with issues around masculinity and the way that they engage the world.
How important was it for you for this initial event to partner with an HBCU like Dillard, particularly in some place like New Orleans, which is still dealing with the remnants of the Gulf, Hurricane Katrina now, 7 years ago? How important was it to make connections with an HBCU like Dillard?
Well, I think, we looked at several organizations, institutions, and to partner with, but Dillard, they welcomed us with open arms. I think they understand the vast issues going on in the African-American male community. And, their athletic director, Ms. Kiki Barnes, and Bernard Griffith, their head coach, who is Avery Johnson's high school coach. He's coached in the NBA, he's coached in college and on the high school level. So he understands the work that we're trying to do and the need for game breakers, frontline solutions, and You Want Game Ventures in the New Orleans market. And I think another thing I would add is, that was just a kickoff to the work that we want to do in New Orleans. And we want to have the legacy projects, coaching development tools, and have a formalized mentorship program for student athletes in that market to, affect the change that we want to see.
Yeah, and we were also able to engage in terms of Dillard really hosting us with their video department. So we had some students that we worked directly with doing video and did a great job for us. You'll see some of that footage later on.
All of this, of course, occurred this past weekend during the Final Four. How much contact was there with the program and the NCAA in any formal way in terms of trying to get the NCAA more involved in the project that you're doing?
Well, we alerted those guys about what we were doing. this year, and we're going to have formalized conversations to work with them next year. But, I'm not sure, we were very busy during the day, but I think they might have had somebody come by and check out the work that we were doing. But they understand that it's new, it's innovative. The way we did it, we were heavy on social media through at You Want Game. I don't know if you got a chance to see that, but I think they understand where we're trying to go, with Game Breakers, and we wouldn't mind working with those guys to really do this in other markets as well.
What are some of the next markets that you're going to hit?
Well, first, we had a great conversation about that yesterday. My hometown, Houston, Texas.
Yeah.
We're going to look at Atlanta, Georgia. There are certain markets through the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, one of our partners, Open Societies Foundation.
Right.
Really are focused on. Chicago, Illinois is a big market. Maybe even over in Durham, North Carolina.
That'd be nice. We'd like that.
Yeah, we got to talk some more about it. So we're actually working on a partnership in North Carolina to do this, not only with an event, but with hopefully a strategy that'll work with multiple districts in Eastern North Carolina. So we're hopeful that will come through for us.
I have a sidebar question for you, Dr. Gilmer. You become a great example of when folks are kind of looking at the landscape of graduate training, getting a PhD, and wondering what else there is besides standing in front of a classroom and writing research articles for the next 30 years of your life. And you are, in fact, in the classroom at UNC Chapel Hill. But talk about, this idea of frontline solutions that, what you were trying to do in terms of your own expertise and experience and partnering with someone like Marcus Littles. You, of course, have Lauren. And I can't remember Lauren's last name off the top of my head right now.
Yeah, Lauren Harris.
Lauren Harris also getting involved. And of course, he comes from a foundation background at places like Ford, et cetera, et cetera. Talk about the kind of work that you hope to achieve with an organization like Frontline Solutions.
Yeah, I think it's the sort of classic story where I didn't really fit into any one box, right? There's a piece of me that's an academic and that cares very much about doing peer-reviewed research and that cares about being in the classroom, and it's stuff that I still do. There's also a piece of me that really wants to be involved on the ground level, sort of hands-on and change. And so Frontline was a great venue for me to do that. I get to travel across the country and sort of interface with, learn from, break bread with nonprofit leaders across the country. And having the PhD gave me sort of some training in terms of qualitative methods. I've added some quantitative learning on my own. But more than that, gave me sort of a credential and sort of a way to get in the door or have a way into some of these conversations to be transparent around some of these issues and challenges.
We've been joined this afternoon by Dr. Micah Gilmer, who's a specialist in applied research and social enterprise and a senior partner at Frontline Solutions, a social change organization, and Mr. Joe Branch, a former associate brand manager for Nike and a former senior manager of global marketing partnerships for the NBA, and he's a founding partner of You Want Game Ventures. Thank you both for joining us from Mobile, Alabama. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.